What's the use of talking when you're stony broke and walking, and the blucher boots are squeaking and the water bag is leaking, and you're tramping in a creek bed 90 miles from anywhere?
Memories of the Great Depression. Bill Bunbury here with Stoney Broke and Walking. Personal accounts of those difficult years in the 1930s. Some of the people you'll hear were children at the time and can remember their parents' struggle to make ends meet. Others were then young adults, trying to find work or run a home and raise a family. All have one thing in common. They've never forgotten the Depression, a creeping disease which spread until it touched their personal lives. But if the Depression spread from anywhere, it spread from the country to the city. In the 1930s, Australia's fortunes were tied to the farm. So when wool and wheat prices fell, the bottom dropped out of the economy.
You see, there was very little else in Western Australia, and the people were dependent upon the produce from the land, wheat and sheep, and the shipping which was generated in order to take the wheat away and the wool away.
Before the Depression started in the 29s, my father, being a farmer, had 4 or 5 men working for him, and as soon as wheat dropped in one day for 4 and 6 a bushel to 1 and 8 a bushel, well, all men had to leave.
People were absolutely devastated by the conditions under which they were living. They had no ready money at all. They were issued credit by what was then the Agricultural Bank, later the R&I Bank. I think the amount given to a single person was £3 a month, and a married person, I think, had £4 or £5 a month. That was in credit, not in hard cash, and there were many instances of people who just hadn't got money even to buy a postage stamp.
People who had employees on the farm were told on more than one occasion that they couldn't afford to pay wages. And I know of several cases where head office said on submitting the budget of such and such, he cannot afford to carry an employee at all. And the chap had come in and tell us, well, Joe, Jack, Bill has been with me 3 years, he's a darn good bloke, I can't turn him out on the road with nothing. And the bank manager would say, well, head office says you've got to. The only thing I can suggest is you can't pay him wages, but there's no reason why you shouldn't keep him on if he's agreeable. And when you come to town the weekends, give him a bit of tobacco money and let him have a few beers as you would your family.
In the 30s and 31s, they used to walk back from Perth, to come back to the farm just for a meal. And my father was a bit soft, so they'd stay there for the year for nothing. They'd get their meals and tobacco. And if the harvest was good, they might have got 10 or 12 pounds for clothes at the end of the year. But they were happy to do that.
My father, I think it broke his heart. My father was a farmer from a very young man. From then on, he had very poor health. He'd been a healthy man, really, until then. He had to go rabbit trapping, he had to go clover rolling for the farmers around who he had been equals with.
I remember in 1929 for the harvest seeing dozens and dozens of the new AL harvesters going up on the train to the new wheat areas which had been thrown open the previous 5 years. 132, they were all coming back again. They had been repossessed.
And then they sold the farm, sold everything you had, your wheat and your seed wheat. But the Farmers' Union come into it then, and they used to black down the sales, and nobody had bid. And then you'd make an arrangement with the bank to buy the lot for £60, about $4,000 worth of machinery and horses, etc., etc. But they'd give you no money to carry on. That's if you did that, and you had 12 months or 2 years to pay the £60 even.
We were really struggling, and my father, the bank, put him off the farm. We had nowhere to go. They didn't even let us take any furniture. We had to leave everything behind. We would just have to walk off the farm in the clothing we had.
There was a lot of amazing stoicism amongst the farmers who simply stayed. I had lunch with one person at Campion, for instance, near the rabbit-proof fence, and with the bank manager, who was doing his level best to help these people. And I said, in my innocence in those days, having not had a great experience in the wheat belt, why do you stay if conditions are so bad? And the man looked at me and said, well, my daughter, aged 14, actually dressed and cooked this sheep that we're eating, which, he said with a smile, belonged to the bank. We could not raise the fare for all the family to go to Perth if we wanted to, and when we got there we would have nowhere to go, so at least we have a roof over our head and we will stay here.
We tried to sell fish. The people of Augusta used to make their living out of that, and often they'd be working in pairs, of course, and they would come to us and say, what are you doing tonight? And we'd say, nothing. And they'd say, right, oh, well, if you're ready at 6:30, we'll go out netting. And a third for you, a third for me, and a third for the boat. Well, you'd go out, and I don't know whether you've ever experienced that sort of thing, or people that have would realise what it's like to be out to hauling a net in the middle of winter, wet to the skin, and hopping out into water up to your chest, and then hauling about 300 or 400 yards of fish net up the beach, and the cold water would be running up your arms as you put it back on the net board. And you get terrific pains in the stomach from the intense cold. And that's where that 1 8p came. That was 8 hours of night work, freezing cold. And that was my payment for one night's work.
I think being young, this makes all the difference. And when you've got other people who are in the same box, you sort of make a bit of a joke of it, you know, and say, well, I can't afford butter, so I'll just eat dripping. See? And dripping was the mainstay of life in those days.
We ate about 32 pigs, one after the other. We were all heartily sick of pigs.
I don't go fishing anymore. Anybody says, do you want to go fishing? I say, no, I had to go fishing too often as a means of eating, and I certainly couldn't be bothered going fishing for sport. When I'm hungry, I'll go fishing again.
Many's a time I was only left with 2 shillings. You couldn't go to any pictures or any entertainment. Well, my mum and dad were struggling and you couldn't ask for help, so you just, put up with it.
I wouldn't like anyone else to have to go through what I considered I had, walking along the street trying to find 6p to pick up to go to the butcher's and buy a shank for the baby's broth. That's the sort of thing that I did, and I never ever found any. But found a friendly butcher who used to give us the biggest one he could find.
Clothes was the main thing, because after we wore out what we had, it was very hard. You couldn't buy clothes out of the money that you had. You could buy like your groceries and little things for the little kids, but you could not buy clothes.
I was often handed down men's beautiful serge trousers to make up for my son. I made his trousers right up till he was 9. Lined them with flour bags, because they don't have flour bags now, but they were lined with flour bags. You'd often find the printing on the inside of the trousers. I never bought any clothes for 5 years, I suppose.
Now, in North Fremantle itself, there was scarcely a home where there wasn't somebody out of work, and in some homes, everybody out of work.
I can recall standing in queues here in St George's Terrace, and I used to have to catch the train at 7 o'clock in the morning, get down to Perth at 8:45. By that time, there was a lot more in front of me, and I would probably finish up in the end of the queue by 12 o'clock with saying that the position had been filled.
Men who had trades of bricklayers and plasterers and had bought their homes thinking they were going to start off fairly well, they lost the lot because they just couldn't afford to pay the rent. And they got to be so depressed that when they left the place, they felt that by going to something that was much less made them very depressed and very bitter.
My husband was more depressed than I, because, he was a good tradesman. He couldn't get work. He walked Perth to get work, and he couldn't get work.
Well, all there was around the towns was a spirit of despair. There were these camps where men worked at idle, useless work for 1 week out of 3. and for the other weeks they lived in soggy tents. They did some worthwhile work, I suppose. They drained a few swamps and they dug a few irrigation ditches. But it was all soul-destroying, disheartening.
Some went back, and there were some that went berserk a bit, went mentally, and there was a few that committed suicide. A lot of them got very demented at Black Boy Camp. They did, they just couldn't take it, and a lot of them couldn't face doing the heavy manual work. Some were sent up on farms, and they were just, get off of here. They had no idea of farms.
There was roughly about 20 men on the thing that I was working on, and all that you had is the tent and a kerosene tin or something to cook your meals in. You had 200 gallons of water per week, so nobody, after a very hot day, had a shower and things. There was no such thing as water, you see. And they used to work 6 days a week, and the wages was £3.2 a week, and that was to keep their families in Perth as well as themselves. And they were mainly elderly men. Well, they looked elderly to me at that time. I was only about 17, working on the job, and most of them were far too weak to work at all, actually.
They would come to me, some of them, and say, look, I've got a very bad back, or I'm first sick, and because I wasn't in a position to say, well, don't work, but not being a cruel sort of person, I used to sort of fix them up with jobs where I couldn't see them and nobody else could see whether they worked or whether they didn't work. But they certainly had a rotten time.
They would come down, sometimes in the middle of the night they would be dropped off at Cranbrook or Boyatbrook. This was in winter, pouring rain. They would be brought out, get out there at midnight and have to put up their tents. The tent poles would be thrown on the ground, they'd be given a tent, and they'd have to start a new life. Well, of course, the old hands there would then have to accept them, and they would have to be accepted. And it would be very difficult when you didn't know what a shovel was, perhaps you didn't know how to put a tent up, you had maybe worked in a shop or an office or whatever, and suddenly here you were confronted with this absolutely new way of life, and you had to find a new identity for yourself.
But for those impatient with the dreariness of the Susso camp, there was always the open road, and in the early 1930s, hundreds of men of all ages took to the track, World War I veterans and boys of 15, all getting away from the towns.
What's the use of talking when you're stony broke and walking, and the blucher boots are squeaking and the water bag is leaking, and you're tramping in a creek bed 90 miles from anywhere? In my case, we were on the tracks and the back tracks of the northwest, where it was quite easy to get to 90 miles from anywhere, and in Queensland and the Northern Territory and South Australia, New South, everywhere, Tassie even. It was quite easy for swagmen to get 90 miles from anywhere and nothing ahead.
In almost every country town, you would always find the hobos camp. They used to call us hobos. You'd always find the hobos camp down at the standpipe, where the railway engines, tanks were filled up. There would always be lumps of coal there too, so there'd be a fire going and possibly 2, 3, half a dozen men sitting around with their keeping gear. You'd walk in and there was a lot of information was passed around there.
There was a system of code marks, and everybody understood those. Don't go to that house, you'll get no food. These are good people, you'll get food. That's what they literally meant. They were in the railway sheds where people would get coal. They'd put information where was a good bite and which was a bad bite.
We went to the local baker in the goldfields towns and the northwest towns, and we said, "G'day, Bake, any chance of chopping some wood for a staley?" And he'd give us 20 blokes here in the last 2 days chopping wood for me, and there's no wood left to chop.
Now, another thing was dog's meat. Then, if you had threepence, you went along to a butcher and asked for threepence worth of dog's meat, because that's all you fed dogs on in those days, so the old butcher would look at you askance, but he'd know what you were after. He knew you were a hobo, So you bought 3p or 6p worth of dog's meat, mostly bones, so you could go and stew them up.
And we found that although we were young and to a certain degree an outcast generation, politicians and the police seemed to think that it would be better if we all just died. Yet the local tradesmen, who were also suffering from the Depression, seemed to find a stale loaf or some clean scrap meat or some spuds and onions or something for us, and we lived.
And there was dozens and dozens of us trying to get a job, and he used to say every morning, "Come back tomorrow, come back tomorrow, come back tomorrow." That lasted for 3 days. So in absolute hunger and in desperation, I went along to the men's mess, the compound as it was called, and tried to beg some food off the proprietress. And the poor woman nearly cried. She said, "Look, son," she said, I've given that much food away, I'm losing money." So I walked, I can't think of the distance, into Cardwell, and there was a wonderful Greek woman who owned a restaurant there, and I decided just to walk in, sit down, have a meal, eat all I could, and just say, "Ring the police." And when I walked in, she could see it, my youth, my desperation. She could spot it. When I sat down, she came up, "Son," she said, "you haven't eaten for days." And she heaped everything she could until I nearly fell asleep on the plate.
There's a lot of comradeship, and that's very much misused word these days, or mateship. It definitely did exist. And my experience of it during Depression and in the army was that it was only born in adversity.
We regarded the blokes in work as fortunate. We didn't regard them as in any way different from us because their jobs could fold up or we could get jobs. And we knew that even where they were working, many of them were not getting the full benefit of their job, their wages, because in many cases a man would be working in, say, the railways. Now, he lived in a rented house in, say, Leederville, but in his house would be not only his wife and 3 children, but his brother's wife and 2 or 3 children, while his brother was away scouring the goldfields in the northwest and the Kimberleys and maybe the eastern states for a job.
The road transport was very minimal, so the only way you had to go from one point A to point B, if you heard of a job or of a chance of a job, was to jump the rattler. Now, there's a famous expression which is long forgotten, and it's known as taking it on the fly. This was where you got out near the signal lamps, and before the train speeded up, and you had to go over the side. If it was too fast, you couldn't make it. You got splinters in your hands, you lost your swag, because the first thing you did was throw your swag in, and then you jumped on the side, and if you didn't make it, your swag was gone and your belongings.
I got into an empty truck full of dust and possibly coal dust and sorts of rubbish. But I stretched out, cold night, and just above Kew, a particularly fierce and heavy downpour of rain caught me. And I thought, well, it's a nice old bloody business, isn't it? When a man makes a successful train jump and the good Lord sends heavy rain and there's no getting away from it.
The police, if you were under the canvas in the rattler, they'd come along. If it was stopped, And they naturally stopped, the train stopped. And they'd come along and say, is there any room in there, mate? How is it? You got any room in there? And if you're innocent enough to say, yes, mate, hop in here, out of compassion for a fellow rattler jumper, they'd say, right, out, mate, come on. And this didn't worry you, because if you were starving, you at least had 48 hours of food from the police station.
My children have not known what it is to queue up for a job as I did.
It was an experience that I wouldn't wish on anyone again. It was a drudgery and second-hand clothing, and you used to patch up.
People do try to belittle you, and that's always been a great thing with me. I can't stand people to be belittled.
A lot of us couldn't see any end to it all. We imagined that this was going to last a long, long time. It did last a long, long time when you consider that a lad of, say, 15, he was 20 before there was any great daylight. The morning star might come up, but it was a hell of a long time before sunrise.
That was Stoney Broke and Walking, Memories of the Great Depression, in which you heard from Donald Stewart and Richard Bealby, John Tonkin, Norman Lockyer, Ted Johnson, Eileen Marsh, Laurie Fox, Dick Chiffings, Annie Bond, Dol Brooks, Annie Evans, and Bill Hampton. Special effects, Peter Taplin and Bill Napier. Technical production, Ido Brands. I'm Bill Bunbury.